Welcome to Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. It's like coffee with an analyst, or it could be whiskey with an analyst reading a spreadsheet, linking crime events, identifying a series, and getting the latest scoop on association news and training. So please don't be that analyst and join us as we define the law enforcement analysis profession one episode at a time.
How we doing, analysts? Jason Elder here with another LEA podcast deep dive. Before You Leap, episode 4, and with me, as always, for this series is Randy Stickley. Randy, how we doing?
Good, Jason. How about you, sir?
I am hanging in there. It's still early, so I'm not going to make a complete judgment just yet.
Very good. Very good.
All right, let's jump into this. What are we talking about today?
So we've had a couple good conversations, and I only say a couple just because after saying 3, anything is a good couple after that. But the conversation today, I would like to have more of a discussion about how we actually think. And I know we've been talking about this, thinking about thinking about thinking, and it does get a bit redundant to folks that may not necessarily be in the profession, but all the analysts that listen, all those folks that fancy themselves armchair analytical professionals, we are textbook overthinkers. I mean, that's just all there is to it. But what's more important than understanding our biases, those approaches, maybe how we apply them to things like open source, like we had in our last discussion? You really need to key in on how we actually think. And what I mean by that is checking everything that we've previously mentioned at the door, but then carrying forward with it. Now, I've said it before, and I'll always kind of do the boot stomp for those folks that were in the military. You have to understand your own mind. You have to understand what exactly it is you're trying to tell your audience before you even sit down and pen out your product, your briefing, whatever it may be. Because ultimately, if you can't explain what that is through your own lens, through your own cognitive abilities, how can we expect anyone else to truly understand it? But that goes a step beyond that, though. There are contexts and scenarios when you're in your agency, your unit, your organization, whatever it may be, how we could actually utilize those critical thinking skills to actually navigate the day-to-day processes. And what I mean by that is, yes, your normal reporting minutia, but also collecting the information, going into conversations with colleagues, peers, those outside the agency, maybe from another agency, and kind of having that aspect of dealing and negotiating with your executives, those folks that may not necessarily be in the analytical field. Some folks work in shops where they are governed and dictated by executives that are field agents, or maybe folks that offer a different perspective. They are very learned in their aspects, but don't understand what that analytical unit does. So there are different ways we can go about that, but I'd like to kind of take our conversation in that direction today, Jason.
It reminds me of habit 5 of the 7 habits of highly effective people. Seek first to understand, then to be understood. I've heard other people in this realm, in this self-improvement talk, actually reverse that, in that to first understand within before you seek. It seems like there's which should come first, the chicken or egg, or which is first there, to seek understanding outward or to seek understanding within.
I would argue to better understand what is happening in a certain context, you would totally have to understand what's going on with yourself first.
Mm-hmm.
How can you offer insights and perspectives to another individual if you can't properly sort all the craziness that's going on in your mind from a day-to-day aspect? So once you actually start to believe, I shouldn't say believe, if you have to BS yourself and what you're thinking, it's probably not true. But if you can start telling yourself, here's what I'm looking at, and remove all of those confirmation biases, external stressors, or maybe internal questions of yourself, then you start to see the world from a more holistic and objective picture. Now, that could take many forms. I've said it before, if you're a note taker, definitely be the note taker in the room. I'm always going to be the advocate for that. Because once you actually start jotting down all of these ideas and these points that you have, sometimes you go back and from that introspective perspective, you start to understand, maybe I'm off base with this. Making something more real and more visceral, it actually allows you to start reprioritizing. Wow, maybe I was a little off base with that. I can go through notes. I'm looking at my volumes of notebooks from throughout my career. I could probably go back in there and look at maybe some initial assessments I made when I was keeping an eye on Islamic State's affiliates in Libya and go, Ooh, I'm certainly glad that didn't make it into a report, just simply because it was completely off base from what was the objective truth was. So once you go from, whatever works for me doesn't necessarily work for everybody. I'm just going to say that right now. This is a purely subjective process, folks. And ultimately, what works for me may not work for any one of the analysts that are listening to this call. So once you understand what works for you and you're able to start kind of processing and making more of a practical summation of that situation, then you can actually start going outward and hearing out some of these folks. Again, no one's perfect. No one's going to ultimately have the objective truth on every single thing at every point in time, because that's just the human condition. But when you have those moments where, specifically in, let's say, a conversation with a colleague, once you have your internal processes and your internal kind of understanding of the scenario, hearing out that individual in that second phase is probably the best step you can have, because now you get to hear what that person's perspective is, or what that colleague or that executive's perspectives may be on the matter. And from there, you can actually start to see where maybe some of the gelling points are. Maybe there's cognitive dissonance, or maybe there's something there that you both can kind of whetstone sharpen each other's skills or insights that may actually produce something that's amiable in terms of your analysis, maybe something in terms of inter-office negotiation, an MOU, or whatever it may be in that particular scenario.
Yeah. I also envision that this process of internalizing your thoughts and understanding approaches to problems and how one thinks is going to develop over time, and the confidence in which the analyst goes about their day is going to change over time. Because I can imagine newer analysts, or maybe analysts that are more timid, are going to be a little bit more hesitant about going through this process and then bringing this process forward, putting all their thoughts out there in the exchange to go in this problem solving process.
You nailed it on the head. This is not a skill that innately we will come out the gate swinging in the analytical profession. I've been at this 11, 12 years. So over time, regardless of the job, the mission, whatever my scope may be, I've gotten more and more experience doing that and just kind of putting my best foot forward. Now, I have been told I am a little bit of a black sheep in terms of the analytical community, because I have no problem having a conversation with somebody. It's exactly why we're here, Jason. We just met at a conference and we struck up a conversation.
Yeah.
But whenever I was a green analyst, I did have those moments where I was impish and sheepish and may not have wanted to project exactly what I was thinking in that time. Again, go back to the rogue notebook idea that I just had a moment ago. But over time, I understood how I got through my process, writing my ideas, writing my thoughts. That was something that helped me gain that skill. Sometimes, and I don't advocate for people to do this in public because people might look at you like you're a crazy person, but sometimes verbalizing it, just talking to yourself about it, kind of hearing the ideas as they come out, almost like a rapid writing kind of scenario, just verbal. But once you start to develop that skill, and once you understand that that internalization process is something that's learned, you'll have confidence to proceed with whatever endeavor it may be. It's actually funny you bring up confidence. That was one of the last IALEA discussions I did, was confidence in your analysis. How do you use this particular skill set to confidently navigate, any of those conversations or any of those uncomfortable situations in your profession?
I do feel that once the analyst gets going and you have a problem that you're looking to solve, you may go through your laundry list of searches or data points or resources that you go through. Maybe we put it in a real-time crime center type thing, right? You get a target, you start going through your list. Each time you do that list, you kind of builds and grows on the previous one. Sometimes analysts, I think, have a tendency to get into the idea of being very clerical about the whole thing. Like, okay, here's my 13 steps. I go through the 13 steps, get the results, and then push out the 13 results, and not taking the time to really think about, number one, the question overall, or even the 13 steps type of thing.
Right.
And so I think that there's their idea of searching for the answers and then actually thinking critically about the question that's being asked, if I'm making sense there.
Yeah, there's a couple of things with that. One of the things, just on face value, you always have to keep that critical aspect of your question in mind, which is the overall premise or the overall question of that intelligence, of that real-time crime problem, or whatever it may be. That'll be your true north. Now, another side of that confidence does come from having that discussion with the requester, the executive, or whomever it may be, if you can, to have discourse with them to ask, maybe we can simplify that question, or maybe we can refine that question. I used to teach analysts quite a bit, and one of the things I used to tell them was it's a law of returns. You put in good, you get out good. You put in mediocre, more likely you're going to get out mediocre. So whenever you get that first phase, that first, hey, here's your target, go forth and conquer. Well, if you give them a very vague kind of tasking in lieu of like a specific tasking, what sounds more doable? Get me information on John Doe, or provide me with holistic pattern of life for John Doe. Well, you're probably going to want to go with the pattern of life of John Doe, because that gives you more insight into, okay, maybe financials, maybe open source, maybe the digital footprint, maybe a whole laundry list of things that you will go through to find that particular piece of information from those steps that you referenced. But if you tell someone just find this in a vague term, there's a greater potential that that individual is going to give you a vague and ambiguous result, not at fault of their own, just it's such a wide aperture that that criticality that we need to afford to it may not necessarily be there because of the wide aperture nature of that task.
Mm-hmm.
But the other thing that went along with that is, and I kind of jotted this down as you were talking about it, but the phrase get comfortable with being uncomfortable does come to mind. My first director told me this, I think it was year 1 or year 2 of being an analyst, that a lot of these scenarios and situations that I was monitoring, they were developing, they were ongoing, but they didn't have a kind of a point final. They didn't have that last kind of capstone to finish it off. Sometimes it was left unrequited and kind of left me in suspended animation of like, when's the other shoe going to drop?
Mm-hmm.
And it did bother me intellectually. From a critical aspect, I would say logically, this has to have an end.
Mm-hmm.
But that was one of those, some people talk about the mental anguish, the heartache of looking at some of this sensitive subject matter. But another level of discomfort, I would argue, is that not being able to scratch that intellectual itch that a lot of folks really get the satisfaction of in this profession. Sometimes, and I tell even analysts that join my team currently, that whenever we go for this and we give a project or we do a product, they say, well, that can't be it. Even after we exhausted all of our resources, I say, look, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, to quote Freud. At the end of the day, we go where the data tells us. We surmise and provide assessment based on what available information is telling us, and we don't necessarily get that closure. And that's perfectly fine. That cues up further criticality as we go through future endeavors, more confidence to make certain assessments based on established precedent and our own analytical thought. But it's a good kind of true north whenever we think about that discomfort that we have throughout the profession.
Mm-hmm. So this goes into the decision making of the analysts as well, because we just staying on the real-time crime center and the 13 steps that I just randomly created.
Sure.
And this is one of the things I normally ask people that work in real-time crime center. At what point do you make the decision to stop going down the rabbit hole and going on to maybe a different source? So if you have the step 1, maybe it's checking LexisNexis. Well, you can start searching people, associates, addresses. You can spend all day in LexisNexis on one target if you wanted to, right? But the analyst has to make the decision based on what's being asked and the time that they're given to complete the task. The time is a big factor in this in terms of making the right decision as to how much effort, how far down that rabbit hole do I go in trying to search and trying to uncover information from each one of these sources to answer the question that's being asked.
So you're talking about something that makes all forms of analysis, intelligence, crime, anything under that umbrella, very relevant here, and that is the timeliness aspects. Intelligence specifically, you talk about anything that's timely and actionable. But at the same time, when you're dealing in a real-time crime center scenario, or if you're an ops center period, you kind of have to think about things in a quick timetable. The turnaround on certain things may not necessarily be suitable for someone to have kind of what they used to call the slow twitch mentality, which doesn't necessarily mean you're doing things from a lack of education perspective or you don't really have a knowledge base, but you're that person that thinks more strategically. And there's nothing wrong with that. I would argue every analyst has that capability to think from not only their tactical perspectives, their operational perspectives, but their strategic perspectives as well. However, when you're in a real-time crime center scenario, RFIs or RFAs come in, you have to be able to turn around quickly and ascertain whether or not that data is valid, whether or not it's a point of misinformation or disinformation, or if it's just an outright incorrect piece of data. Much of that comes from being able to digest information quickly. And I know that's something else that just sounds easy to say it colloquially, but that's something that you also harness over time. Whenever I've been in any of these shops, any new analyst I've ever had, or when I was a new analyst, we were given much more of those kind of long-term projects. How are we going to digest all of this information for a strategic product that doesn't necessarily have a clearly defined time frame of when that product's going out the door? And we would have these conversations with my director, conversations with each other, kind of brainstorming, because again, we were all starting out, and we would start to galvanize with each other. Hey, here's what I found. Let's talk about this. Well, maybe that conflicts with this resource, but let's talk about why that kind of conflicts with each other. So from those discussions, you start to build that kind of, okay, I'm starting to see these signposts, these indicators that these aren't necessarily gelling with the overall narrative. And from there, with experience, you start to develop a way that you kind of internalize again how you look at those data streams and those information databases and start to find, okay, which one of these, for lack of better words, is good and which one is crap in terms of your analysis. Because again, put in good, get out good, put in crap, get out crap.
All right. So for the listeners, before you leap, you should what?
Before you leap, on top of thinking about everything in your project, you should think about how you think. You should think about all the aspects of what makes your thought process so interesting. And from there, you'll be able to actually answer maybe more of those objective questions moving forward.
All right. And if somebody is looking for more information on this topic, is there a periodical or a publication that they can look up?
Well, it's funny you reference that. I'm actually proud to announce, it was earlier this week that it officially dropped, but I actually have a book that's out there. I wrote a book. It is titled Rethinking Thought, A Practitioner's Guide to Critical Thinking and Intelligence Analysis. It's co-authored by myself and the always brilliant Akshata Kumavat. Done some great work with her, presenting at a couple different IALEA conferences now. Just built a really great partnership and professional friendship with AK. And yeah, it's all about what we just talked about here. Pretty much taking all of these niche and very highbrow concepts that many folks don't necessarily prioritize in their day-to-day analytical work and bringing them down to a visceral, pragmatic, and practical approach that makes it a little more approachable and digestible for folks that may be new to the field or maybe anyone that's been seasoned but kind of lost the forest for the trees. So definitely consider looking at that one, folks. Available on Amazon. So yeah, hope you all take that for granted and use it for what it's worth.
We will put a link in the show notes with that Amazon link for those that are interested in the book. And congrats to you and AK. That is an awesome, great collaboration. It's fantastic to see folks that went from presenting together to then having a major publication.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. We're over the moon for it, and we've already talked. There's more to come. So I like to do the whole stay tuned thing, you know?
All right. Well, very good. Well, Randy, again, thank you always for your time here. This is great. I'm really enjoying continuing this series with you before you leap.
Absolutely, sir. Thank you very much for having me again.
All right. Take care.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for making it to the end of another episode of Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. You can show your support by sharing this and other episodes found on our website at www.leapodcasts.com. If you have a topic you would like us to cover or have a suggestion for our next guest, please send us an email at leapodcasts@gmail.com. Till next time, analysts, keep talking.